The only light in the kitchen came from the lamp on the table, and I remember watching the steam rise off the wash water because I could not look at him while he said it. It was a Saturday evening. The bread for Sunday was already cooling on the rack. My apron was still damp from scrubbing the floor one last time. And across the table, my husband set down his coffee, folded his hands the way he folded them before grace, and told me what he needed from me before the sun came up. Not as a question, as preparation. He said it so he could walk into church the next morning clean before God. Before I tell you what that word meant in our house, and what I learned it has meant in plain homes for longer than anyone will admit, I'm Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I tell you the things we were raised to carry in silence. I grew up Old Order Amish, and I left when I could no longer pretend I did not understand what was happening to me. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, subscribe, tap like, and tell me in the comments what you think the day before Sunday looks like in an Amish home. I promise you, it is not what the postcards show. Let me start where it actually starts, because you cannot understand the demand without understanding the day it lives inside. In my community, Saturday was not a day of rest. Saturday was the day you earned your rest. It was the hardest working day of the entire week. Harder than Monday, harder than harvest, because everything had to be finished before sundown. The Sabbath could not be touched by labor, so every piece of labor was crammed into the hours before it. I woke at 4. I baked. I scrubbed the floors on my knees with a brush and a bucket. I blacked the stove. I prepared the cold food for Sunday, because no real cooking was allowed once the day turned. I bathed the younger children one by one in the same water to save the heating. I pressed the white caps and the dark trousers and laid them over the chairs so they would be ready. By the time the light started to go gold and low, the whole house had been made spotless, quiet, and holy. Everything was clean. Everything was prepared. That was the rule that governed everything. You do not enter the Lord's Day carrying the dirt of the week. And here is the part that took me years to be able to say out loud. In my marriage, that rule did not stop at the floors. My husband believed, the way the men in his family had believed before him, that a man should enter the Sabbath emptied, settled, that the restlessness of the body was a kind of dirt, the same as mud on boots, the same as flour on an apron, something to be washed off before prayer. And the washing was me. He called it being made ready. He never raised his voice when he said it. He never had to. He would finish his coffee on a Saturday night, fold his hands, and tell me that he needed to be clean before he could stand in worship the next day, and that I was how he got clean. As if I were the wash basin, as if I were the last chore on the Saturday list, the one that came after the floors and before the sleep. I want you to understand that I did not have language for this then. I had no word for what I was being asked to be. I only knew that on Saturday nights, after the hardest day of my week, when my back ached and my hands were cracked from the lye soap, there was one more task expected of me, and that refusing it was not a thing I understood myself to be allowed to do. Because here is what they build into you, and they build it in young. Submission was not a feeling, it was the structure of the whole world. A wife yields, a husband leads. The bishop said it from the bench in his sermons, the ones that lasted hours on those hard wooden benches. Wives, submit, build a godly household. It was not cruel in how it was said. It was gentle, even loving, which is what made it so total. Nobody ever told me I had a body that belonged to me. Nobody ever told me that the word need could be questioned. I was taught that my comfort was a small thing, and that the smallness of it was holy. That to want my own ease was hochmut, pride, the worst sin we had. So when my husband told me he needed to be made clean for the Lord, every part of my upbringing answered for me before I could. My friend Rachel married a year before I did. We grew up in the same church district, sat near each other at the singings as girls. Years later, both of us married. We were shelling peas on her porch, the men gone to the far field, and she said something so quietly I almost missed it. She asked me if Saturday nights were hard in my house too. I did not answer right away. I did not know I was allowed to. And in that silence she understood, and I understood, and neither of us had to say the rest. Two grown women, mothers by then, who had never once in our lives been told that the thing happening in our homes had a name, or that other women carried the same weight, or that the carrying was not required of us by God. We shelled the peas. We talked about the weather. That was as far as we could go. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform. Not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you what the day before Sunday actually demanded, because the demand sat inside 3 things, and none of them were ever spoken plainly, and all of them shaped my whole marriage. The first was the idea that a man's restlessness is the woman's responsibility. I was taught, never directly, always through the air of the house, that if my husband entered the Sabbath unsettled, that was a failure of mine. A good wife sent her man into the Lord's day at peace. If he was distracted in worship, if his mind wandered on the bench, somewhere underneath it the fault traced back to me. So the demand was never only his want. It was dressed as my duty. It was framed as the last thing I owed the household before the holy day, the same as the bread and the blacked stove, and I carried it the same way, with my head down and my hands busy. The second was the silence. Nothing about marriage was spoken before the wedding, and almost nothing after. There was no mother who sat me down. There was no older woman who explained. The body was not discussed, not the intimate parts of it, not what a wife might feel or want or refuse. To speak of it at all was already immodest. So a girl walked into marriage knowing how to bake for 300 people and nothing at all about the bed she would lie in every night for the rest of her life. The silence was not an accident. The silence was the lock on the door. You cannot ask for something better when you have never been given the words to know that better exists. The third was the way the holy was wrapped around all of it. This is the part that took the longest to untangle. If the demand had simply been a man wanting his wife, I might have understood it sooner. But it was never that. It was sanctified. It was made part of the preparation for worship, knitted right into the Sabbath, so that to refuse it felt like refusing God Himself. How do you say no to the thing that makes your husband clean before the Lord? How do you call something wrong when it has been folded into the most sacred day of the week? That is the trick of it. That is how a thing that should have been mine to give freely became a thing I was not permitted to withhold. I remember one Saturday in particular. I had been on my feet since before dawn. One of the little ones had been sick in the night, so I had slept maybe 2 hours. I had baked, scrubbed, pressed, bathed the children, prepared the cold food, and by the time the sun went down I could barely stand at the basin. And he folded his hands at the table. And I felt something I had never let myself feel before. Not anger. I did not have permission for anger yet. It was closer to grief. A deep, tired grief for the woman I was, who had given the entire day to the household and was now being told the household was not finished with her. I did the dishes very slowly that night. I made them last. And I have thought about that since, how the only refusal I knew how to perform was to wash a clean dish twice. I want to be fair, because the truth has 2 sides and I owe you both of them. My husband was not a monster. He believed what he had been taught as completely as I believed what I had been taught. No one had ever told him either that a wife was a person whose tiredness counted, whose body had its own yes and its own no. He was repeating his father, who repeated his father. The cruelty was not in him. The cruelty was in the system that handed both of us a marriage with no language inside it, and then called the silence holy. We were 2 people raised without the words, doing the only thing the words we had allowed. But I will not pretend it did not cost me, because here is what nobody tells you. There were Sundays I sat on that bench, in my pressed cap, singing from the Ausbund, and felt further from God than I had ever felt in my life. The whole point of the day before had been to make us clean for the day of worship. And I sat there in the worship. That is what they never accounted for. In all their careful arranging of who gets made clean and how, no one ever asked what it does to a woman to be treated as the last surface that needs scrubbing before the sacred can begin. My friend Rachel left 2 years after I did. We talk now, on telephones, in a freedom neither of us imagined as girls shelling peas. She told me once that the first Saturday night after she left, she lay in a bed in an apartment with a lock on the door, and she did not sleep, not from fear, but because for the first time in her adult life, nothing was expected of her when the sun went down. She said she cried for an hour, not from sadness, from the size of it. When I left at 24, The cost came fast, and it came complete. Shunning. The letters I sent home returned unopened. My mother's silence on the telephone the one time she answered. A silence I can still hear. My father's door shut to me. The community that had baptized me and married me and blessed my household closed around the empty place where I had been and did not speak my name. That is the price, and they make sure you know it before you ever consider the door. You do not just lose a religion, you lose every face you have ever loved. In therapy, years later, an English counselor gave me words I had never been allowed to hold. Autonomy, consent, coercion. The idea that a yes given under fear is not the same as a yes given freely. I sat in that office and I described the Saturday nights, the folded hands, the basin, the way it was all wrapped in worship, and she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have carried every day since. She said that control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it dresses as devotion. Sometimes the thing that takes the most from you is the thing that calls itself the most holy. And I grieve the girl I was. The one who scrubbed the floors on her knees and pressed the white caps and gave the whole long day to the household and still believed she owed it one thing more. They told me marriage made me a woman. But being a woman is not yielding. It is not being the last chore before the Sabbath. It is knowing that your own tiredness is real, that your own no is real, that your body was never the dirt anyone needed to wash off before they could pray. The plain world gave me things I will carry as long as I live. A community with a depth most people will never know. Hands that can do any work. A faith that I have had to break and rebuild, but that is still, in its rebuilt form, mine. But there is no scripture that makes a woman a basin. There is no Sabbath holy enough to require her silence. There is no God I believe in now who built a woman's body and then asked her to treat it as the thing standing between her husband and his prayers. If you grew up in a place where your exhaustion was called duty, where your silence was called obedience, where the thing taken from you was wrapped so carefully in the holy that you could not even find it to name it, I see you. You were not too small to matter. You were never the dirt. You were a person the whole time, even on the Saturdays they treated you like the last thing on the list. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.